The desert sun had a way of making everything look older than it was. Paint peeled faster here, wood cracked sooner, and even people seemed to carry the dry weight of time in their faces. I was sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, the one my father built with his own hands in 1952, when my niece, Claire, walked up the path in her crisp white pantsuit and sunglasses. Her heels clicked against the flagstones as though she were walking toward a podium, not her elderly aunt. "You should be resting, Aunt Margaret," she said, glancing around at the house like she was appraising it for auction. "At your age, you shouldn't be stressing over, well, anything." Her words landed sharper than the desert wind. At 82, I'd heard my share of backhanded remarks, but Claire had a particular gift for dressing insults in polite lace. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of sweet tea, feeling the condensation run down my fingers. "I'm not dead yet," I replied. She smiled thin, tight, and sat down on the porch railing like she owned the place. "You've had a good run, but let's be realistic. You're too old to manage this property. And once you're gone," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the hot air. It wasn't the first time she'd hinted at my supposed expiration date, but something about that day felt different. She wasn't just making conversation, she was setting the stage. That's when I saw the envelope in her hand. Cream-colored, heavy paper, with the name of a law firm embossed in gold. She handed it to me like she was doing me a favor. "It's from Uncle Robert's estate attorney," she said, tilting her head. "He thought you should have it before the will reading next week. Just, to prepare yourself." The paper was warm from the sun, or maybe from her hand. I slid it open with my thumbnail, the way my father used to open his letters, slow and precise. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper with a neat paragraph typed in the center. It said, in language so polished it almost hid the cruelty, that my late husband Robert's estate, valued at just over $8 million, would be divided among the surviving family members, as listed in an attached schedule. I wasn't on it. Not my name, not even a passing mention. As if I'd been erased like chalk from a board. I looked up at Claire, who was watching me the way a hawk watches a rabbit that's just realized it's cornered. "I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "But Robert always thought you were better off with the ranch. He probably figured you wouldn't need any of the money. The ranch, this patch of desert dirt with its cracked windmill and stubborn mesquite trees, it was my heart, my history, but it wasn't liquid cash, and she knew it." I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the armrest of my chair. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Well," I said, "I guess we'll see what the lawyer says." She gave a little shrug and stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her pantsuit. "Just remember, Aunt Margaret, the reading's only a formality. The decision's already been made." When she left, the air felt heavier, even though the sky was as cloudless as ever. I sat there for a long time, listening to the creak of the porch boards, the buzz of cicadas in the distance, and the faint hiss of wind across the sand. They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought too old meant too weak. They had no idea. The week leading up to the will reading felt like standing on a railroad track, hearing a train in the distance, but not knowing which direction it was coming from. I kept busy with chores, not because they needed doing, but because stillness let the thoughts creep in. My father's old leather gloves sat on the fence post by the barn, exactly where I'd left them after patching the west fence. The hens clucked lazily in the coop, unaware that the woman feeding them was on the verge of being cut out of her own life. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped, expecting it to be Claire again, or worse, her brother Daniel. He hadn't called in years, but now that money was involved, I wouldn't put it past him to check in. Sure enough, 3 days before the will reading, his number popped up on my old landline. "Aunt Margaret." His voice was too bright, too warm. "It's been ages. How are you holding up after Robert's passing?" "Fine, Daniel," I said flatly. "I just wanted to, make sure you're not too stressed about next week. I mean, these legal things can get complicated." I could almost hear him rehearsing his lines, trying to sound concerned while fishing for information. "I'll manage," I replied. He chuckled, low and patronizing. "Well, I just wanted you to know, we're all family here. Whatever happens, I'm sure Robert had his reasons. Maybe you should focus on enjoying your time. You've worked hard enough. Enjoy my time." The same poisoned candy Claire had offered days earlier. Sweet on the outside, lethal inside. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the worn linoleum floor. That S when I remembered something Robert used to say whenever someone underestimated him. Never let them think they got you cornered. Corners have edges, and edges cut. Robert had been many things: stubborn, opinionated, and yes, sometimes infuriating, but he'd never been cruel. The idea that he'd intentionally erase me from his will didn't sit right. I decided to pay a visit to the one man who might know the truth before it was served cold in a stuffy office. Robert's lawyer, Henry Calloway. Henry's office was in downtown Tucson, tucked between a pawn shop and a taxidermy store, the kind of place you might miss if you weren't looking for it. The sign above the door was faded, the gold lettering nearly worn away. Calloway and Pierce, attorneys at law. Inside, it smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. Henry was in his late 60s now, with a shock of white hair and reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. "Margaret," he said warmly, rising from behind his desk. "I wasn't expecting you until the reading. I need to ask you something," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He gestured for me to sit, then folded his hands on the desk. "Go on. Did Robert really cut me out of the will?" Henry's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted just enough for me to notice. "Margaret, you know I can't." "Henry," I interrupted, leaning forward. "We've known each other 30 years. Don't hide behind your client privilege now. Robert's gone. I'm still here." He sighed and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "All I can say is, the will you'll hear next week is not the first version Robert signed." The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. Not the first version. There were amendments, he said carefully. Some recent and not all in Robert's handwriting. That was all he'd give me. But it was enough. Someone had tampered with the will, and if I had to bet, I'd put my money on Claire and Daniel. When I left Henry's office, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something hotter, sharper resolve. They thought I'd walk into that will reading like a lamb to slaughter. Instead, I'd be walking in with my head high, my back straight, and the quiet knowledge that they weren't as untouchable as they thought. The night before the reading, I sat at my desk and pulled out the old wooden box where Robert kept every receipt, contract, and letter he'd ever deemed important. It took hours, but just after midnight, I found an older copy of the will, dated 4 years earlier. My name was there, in bold ink, listed as the sole beneficiary of the ranch and a share of the estate. I placed it in a folder and slid it into my bag. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just be attending a will reading. I'd be delivering a revelation. The morning of the will reading, Tucson's heat was already rising, the kind that makes the asphalt shimmer. I dressed deliberately pressed slacks, a white blouse, and Robert's old silver bolo tie. Not because I cared what Claire or Daniel thought, but because appearances were a kind of armor. The law office lobby was small but tidy, with potted ferns in the corners and a glass water dispenser sweating in the heat. Claire was already there, perched on the edge of her seat like she owned the place. Her lipstick was too bright for morning. Her smile stretched to thin. Daniel arrived minutes later, wearing a suit that looked like it had been bought for the occasion. The sleeves just a little too long, the shoulders a little too wide. He gave me a nod that tried to be polite, but landed somewhere between smug and pitying. Henry Calloway's assistant ushered us into the conference room. It smelled faintly of leather and paper, with the heavy curtains drawn against the sun. The long mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights. We sat. Henry entered, carrying a thick folder, his glasses sliding down his nose. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice even. "As you know, we're here to execute the last will and testament of Robert M. Whitmore." He unfolded the document, and I noticed his eyes flick briefly to me before he began to read. "I, Robert M. Whitmore, being of sound mind and body." The words were dry, legal, and stripped of the man I knew. But then came the line I'd been waiting for. "Do hereby bequeath the sum of $50,000 to my nephew, Daniel Whitmore, and the remainder of my estate, including the Whitmore Ranch, to my beloved niece, Claire Whitmore." Silence fell heavy over the room. Claire's painted smile widened. Daniel's eyebrows lifted in a look of pleasant surprise, and me, I stayed perfectly still. Henry closed the will and looked up. "This concludes the reading." Claire let out a little laugh, the kind meant to sound gracious, but that came out triumphant. "Well, I suppose Uncle Robert wanted to make sure the ranch stayed in the family." "In the family," I repeated, my voice calm but sharp enough to make her flinch. She shifted in her seat. "Of course, Aunt Margaret, You've done so much over the years, but maybe he thought you deserved a rest. You're not exactly what? I asked, leaning forward. Daniel cleared his throat. Look, Margaret, maybe this isn't the time. Oh, I think it's exactly the time, I said, sliding the folder from my bag, because before we all pretend this is how Robert intended things, I think you should see this. I opened the folder and laid the older will on the table, the one dated 4 years ago, the one in Robert's handwriting. Henry's eyes widened as he saw it. This is a copy of Robert's will before certain amendments were made, I said. In this version, the ranch and estate go to me solely. Claire's face paled under her makeup. That doesn't prove anything. People change their minds. People do, I agreed. But Robert didn't write the changes in the version you just heard. I turned to Henry. Isn't that right? Henry shifted uncomfortably. I can't discuss. You already told me, I said, that not all the changes were in his handwriting. Daniel's chair scraped back. Are you accusing us of something? I met his gaze steadily. I'm saying someone took advantage of a dying man's trust, and I intend to find out who. For a moment, the room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Then Claire laughed again, but this time it was brittle, almost breaking. This is ridiculous. The will we just heard is legal, notarized. Legal doesn't mean honest, I said. Henry cleared his throat. If there's an allegation of undue influence, that would be a matter for the courts to decide. I smiled then, not because anything was funny, but because the first stone had been thrown, and I could see the ripples spreading. Good, I said. Then, I'll see you there. When I left the conference room, I didn't look back. The older will was safely back in my bag, along with something even more valuable, the sight of Claire and Daniel realizing, for the first time, that their victory wasn't final. Outside, the desert sun was blinding, but I felt lighter than I had in weeks. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence after Thomas's last words was thick enough to feel. You could have heard the tick of the clock in the hallway, if not for Sheila's ragged breathing. Martin leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me like I'd just personally set fire to his childhood home. You're telling me, he said slowly, that after everything we've done for you, I cut him off. Everything you've done for me. My voice was low, but the edge in it made Sheila flinch. You've lived here rent-free. You've eaten my food, driven my car, run up my electric bill. And for what? Company? Kindness? I leaned forward. No, Martin, you've been circling like vultures, waiting for me to die. Sheila slammed her palms on the table. We deserve something. You can't just cut family out like, you're not my family, I said, each word deliberate. Blood doesn't make you family, actions do, and yours have been nothing but selfish. Thomas cleared his throat, not unkindly, and slid the folder shut. Legally, this meeting is concluded. I'd advise you both to leave. Sheila stood, her chair screeching across the floor. This isn't over, she hissed, pointing at me. We'll find a way. Her heels clicked sharply as she stormed out, Martin trailing after her, but not before giving me one last glare so full of hate it was almost cold-blooded. When the door shut behind them, the quiet was like exhaling after holding my breath too long. Thomas looked at me. You've made enemies. I know, I said, but I've also drawn the line. On the drive home, the desert looked different, less like an empty stretch of nothing, and more like a fortress. But the moment I turned down my long graveled driveway, my stomach tightened. The front gate was ajar. I always locked it, always. Pulling up to the house, I saw it immediately. My garden, torn through, flower pots shattered, the bench Henry built for me, tipped over and splintered. I stepped out of the car, the air smelling faintly of something acrid like burnt paper. In the middle of the gravel path was a charred pile of what used to be photographs, my wedding pictures. The message was clear. That night, I double-checked every lock, pulled the blinds tight, and kept the porch light on until dawn. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the house settling. The next morning, a letter slid under my front door. No envelope. Just one sentence, typed in bold letters. If we don't get what we deserve, we'll take something you can't replace. I stared at the words until they blurred. My hands trembled not from fear exactly, but from the realization that the game had shifted. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was war. The letter stayed on my kitchen table all day, a silent dare. I must have read it 20 times, each pass making the words feel heavier, more like a countdown. By sunset, I had made up my mind. If Martin and Sheila thought they could scare me into undoing the will, they didn't know me at all. I drove into town and walked straight into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Carter, a wiry man in his 60s with eyes that didn't miss much, listened quietly as I slid the letter across his desk. He read it once, then again, before looking at me. "You think it's them?" "I know it's them," I said. "And you know what they're capable of when they don't get their way." Carter leaned back, tapping his pen. "We can't prove they wrote it, but we can start a harassment record. That way, if anything else happens, we have a trail." "Anything else?" I asked. "They burned my wedding pictures." "Carter," he nodded slowly, "I'll send a deputy to patrol near your property at night. But be careful, Linda. People get desperate when they think something's been taken from them." That night, the desert wind howled against the house. Somewhere out there, a loose piece of tin on the barn roof rattled like distant gunfire. I didn't sleep, but I didn't feel powerless either, not anymore. The next morning, I awoke to a noise outside, low, deliberate, the crunch of tires on gravel. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Martin's truck parked at the edge of my driveway. He didn't get out. He just sat there, staring at the house, the sunlight glinting off his sunglasses. Then, after what felt like a full minute, he drove off without a word. That's when I decided it was time to flip the script. I called Thomas, my lawyer, and asked, "What happens if I move up the transfer date for the land?" There was a pause. "It's unusual," he said, "but perfectly legal. It would mean the land changes hands while you're still alive. No waiting for probate. No chance for them to contest it after your passing. Do it," I said. "I want the paperwork ready by next week." The following days were quiet to quiet. No phone calls, no uninvited visits, but the silence felt more dangerous than the threats, like the desert before a dust storm. On Friday, I was in the garden replanting what they destroyed when I heard the sharp bark of tires behind me. Martin's truck. He and Sheila stepped out, both dressed in black like they were attending a funeral. Sheila's smile was thin and cruel. "We just wanted to see how you were doing," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm fine," I replied, straightening up, trowel still in my hand. Martin's eyes flicked to the barn, then back to me. "Shame about what happened to your pictures. Accidents happen." I met his gaze without flinching. "So do consequences." His jaw tightened. "You think you've won, old lady, but you haven't seen what we can do." Before I could respond, Sheriff Carter's cruiser turned down the drive, dust trailing behind it. Martin and Sheila froze, then slowly backed toward their truck. "Afternoon," Carter called, stepping out. "Everything all right here?" Sheila forced a smile. "Just checking on our dear aunt." Carter's eyes narrowed. "From what I hear, she doesn't need checking on. Now get moving." They left without another word, but I knew this wasn't their last visit. It was just the last time they'd come without a plan to do real damage. 2 days after their visit, the real attack came not in the form of words or threats, but in something far colder. It was just before dawn when I smelled it. Smoke. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. The smell was coming from outside. Throwing on my robe, I stepped onto the porch. The barn was glowing faintly in the darkness, an eerie orange halo spilling from its open door. I sprinted across the gravel, the desert air cutting like glass in my lungs. Inside, a stack of old hay bales was smoldering, a thin plume of smoke curling upward. Whoever started it hadn't done the job right, thank God. I grabbed the fire extinguisher by the door and emptied it onto the embers until the air stank of chemical foam instead of smoke. My hands were shaking, not just from fear but from rage. They'd crossed the line. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was war. By the time Sheriff Carter arrived, I had the extinguisher lying on its side and the hay scattered across the dirt. "They were here," I said, my voice shaking. "I know it." Carter crouched, running a finger over a fresh set of tire tracks leading away from the barn. "We'll have them looked at, but you need to think about your safety now, Linda. If they're willing to do this." "I'm not running," I said, my voice low but steady. "Not from my land." That morning, I made another call to Thomas. "Move the signing date up to tomorrow," I told him, "and tell the kids to be there early." The next day, under a pale Arizona sky, my 3 chosen heirs, none of them blood relatives, sat with me in Thomas's office. The documents were thick, every page stamped and initialed. When I signed the last one, the land was no longer mine. It was theirs. And Martin and Sheila couldn't touch it, not in court, not in life. It was the first time in weeks I felt the knot in my chest loosen. That evening, I sat on the porch sipping tea when Martin's truck appeared again, kicking up a trail of dust. This time, Sheila stayed in the passenger seat, arms crossed. Martin leaned out the window. "Heard you've been busy." "Linda, not busy," I said, setting down my cup, "just making sure your inheritance problem is solved." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means the land's no longer mine," I said, standing. "It belongs to people who won't be bullied, and who won't hesitate to call the law if you so much as set foot on it." For the first time, I saw real fear in his expression, not fear of me, but of losing. They left without another word, the roar of the engine fading into the desert night. But something told me this wasn't over. Not until I faced them where they least expected, under oath, with every lie they'd told, laid bare. The court date was set for the following Monday, and I was ready. The courthouse in Maricopa was a squat sand-colored building that looked more like a post office than the place where people's fates were decided. But inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of old paper, floor polish, and nerves. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, with Thomas beside me. Across the aisle sat Martin and Sheila, dressed in clothes they probably thought made them look respectable. Sheila's hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. Martin kept adjusting his tie, like the fabric was strangling him. Case number 4587B, Contest of Will and Property Transfer. Let's proceed. Martin's attorney went first, painting a picture of me as a confused, lonely widow someone easily manipulated. He used words like influenced and incompetent as if I weren't sitting right there. When it was our turn, Thomas rose. As ever, Your Honor, what you will hear today is not about confusion. It's about entitlement. My client was fully capable, fully aware, and fully determined to protect her property from those who never lifted a finger to earn it. I was called to the stand. The bailiff swore me in, and I gripped the armrests, my palms damp. Thomas began softly, letting me tell the story in my own words. The years of tending the land, the way my husband and I built it together, acre by acre, the night the hay was set on fire, the tire tracks, the threats. Then came the cross-examination. Martin's lawyer tried to rattle me, but I kept my voice steady. "No, sir," I said when he implied I'd been coerced. "I signed those papers because I wanted to, because I want to leave my life's work to people who see me as a wallet on legs." The room was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys. Thomas's final move was the most devastating. He called the county recorder's office to confirm the deed transfer was complete. Before Martin and Sheila even filed their petition, the judge leaned back, tapping her pen. "Well, that makes this straightforward." She turned to them. "You have no legal claim to the property. Furthermore, given the testimony and evidence presented, I am awarding court costs to the defendant." Martin's face drained of color. Sheila muttered something under her breath, her hands twisting in her lap. I didn't smile. Not in court. But as we walked out into the bright Arizona sun, the weight I'd carried for months finally lifted. Outside, the people I'd given the land to were waiting. We hugged, and I felt their arms wrap around me like a shield, one I knew would last long after I was gone. That night, I sat on the porch, the desert quiet except for the distant call of a coyote. They said I was too old to matter, I murmured into the darkness. But today, I proved them wrong. And in that moment, with the stars spilling across the endless sky, I realized I hadn't just kept my land, I'd kept my dignity, my voice, my say in how my story would end.